The splash echoed across the still water of Lake Tahoe like a gunshot, shattering the quiet of the early morning. I stood on the weathered wooden dock, my fishing rod forgotten in my hand, watching as my daughter-in-law, Brenda, stood panting, her expensive designer heels sinking into the damp wood. She thought she was alone. She thought the only witness to her crime was the thick mist rolling off the freezing water. But I had been sitting in my battered Ford pickup truck, sipping black coffee from a thermos, waiting for the sun to rise. To her, I was Arthur Pendleton, a 70-year-old retired mechanic, a man who spent his days fixing leaky faucets and mowing her overgrown lawn. She did not know that the hands she had just ordered to scrub her floors were the same hands that had built an empire. Brenda had tossed a faded leather suitcase into the lake. It was not just any luggage. It was the old Samsonite I had used for decades, the one she had sneered at when she moved into my late son's house. She had told me last night, her voice dripping with venom, that she was cleaning out the garbage before the estate lawyers arrived. My son, David, had been gone for 3 years, and ever since his passing, Brenda had made it her mission to erase me from his memory and his assets. She had called me a senile old leech, a burden her family was forced to carry. But as the suitcase broke the surface and sank into the dark water, I knew she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She did not know what was inside. She only knew it was heavy, and she wanted it gone forever. I did not confront her right then. I let her drive away in her leased Mercedes, her red taillights fading into the morning fog. Instead, I walked to the edge of the dock and picked up my phone. I dialed a number I had not used in 15 years, and Marcus answered on the second ring. I told him I needed the retrieval team at the North Dock, and I asked him to have the forensic accountants ready. The bait had been taken. For 20 years, I had played the party of the grieving, simple father-in-law. After David died, Brenda had legally maneuvered to keep me in the guest house, claiming it was out of the goodness of her heart. In reality, she needed a live-in servant and a tax dependent. She had mocked my worn-out clothes, thrown away my late wife's photo albums, and treated me like a stray dog she could not quite get rid of. She thought I was a nobody, a man whose only value was the monthly Social Security check she had somehow managed to intercept. But the Pendleton family fortune was not built on real estate or stocks. It was built on industrial patents, and I was the sole living trustee. The suitcase she had just destroyed contained the original, unregistered blueprints and the physical rare bonds that proved my ownership of the Pendleton Trust. She had tried to steal them, failed to crack the safe, and decided to destroy the evidence rather than let me have it. By noon, the retrieval team had the suitcase. Inside, exactly as I suspected, were the documents she had been searching for, wrapped in waterproof oilcloth. But she had also tossed in a burner phone and a stack of printed bank statements. She had been siphoning money from David's life insurance policy, forging my signature on medical bills, and planning to sell the lake house to a developer to pay off her gambling debts. She had even drafted papers to have me declared mentally incompetent, using a doctor she was paying off. The suitcase was not just trash to her. It was her entire criminal portfolio, and she had just handed it to me on a silver platter. The real game began at the family meeting 3 days later. Brenda had gathered her lawyer, her new boyfriend, and a judge she had bribed to hear the emergency petition regarding my mental state. She sat at the head of the mahogany table in the study, wearing a smug smile, ready to sign away my freedom and my home. Her boyfriend, a slick real estate agent named Chad, leaned back in his chair, looking at me with undisguised contempt. Brenda spoke to me, her voice dripping with false sympathy. She told me they just wanted what was best for me. She said I was confused, that I had been talking to myself and wandering the woods. She told me it was time to let them take care of things. I sat quietly, my hands folded over my wooden cane. I let them talk. I let them paint the picture of the senile old man who had lost his mind and his money. I watched Chad smirk as he slid the incompetency papers across the table. I watched Brenda's lawyer nod in agreement. I let the hatred and the arrogance fill the room until it was thick enough to choke on. Then, I stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, placing it gently on the table. I looked at Brenda and told her that before she signed those papers, I believed she had dropped something in the lake. I opened the envelope. The first thing I pulled out was the burner phone. I placed it on the table. Then came the forged bank statements. Then, the paid-off doctor's signed confession, obtained by my private investigators an hour ago. Finally, I laid down the original trust documents, the ones she had tried to drown. The silence in the room was absolute. The color drained from Brenda's face as she read at the waterproof oilcloth. She recognized it. She knew exactly what it was. I told her that I did not retire because I was old. I retired because I was tired of watching vultures circle my family. David was a good man, but he was blinded by love. Brenda was not blinded. She was simply greedy, and greed makes people see a realist. Chad stood up, his face red with anger. He shouted that this was a trick, that I was senile and did not know what I was saying. I replied calmly that I knew exactly what I was saying. I also knew that he had been using Brenda's stolen funds to finance his failed condo developments in Reno. I had the transfer receipts right there. I tossed a second stack of papers onto the table. Chad collapsed back into his chair, his mouth hanging open. Brenda's lawyer was frantically flipping through the documents, his hands shaking. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with panic. He told her this was fraud, embezzlement, and attempted elder abuse. I spoke softly, telling him it was worse. It was a breach of the Pendleton Trust. Since she tried to destroy the trust's founding documents, she had forfeited any claim to David's estate. In fact, she owed the trust $3 million Rs in misappropriated funds, plus penalties. The next hour was a masterclass in destruction. I did not yell. I did not threaten. I simply presented the facts, each one a hammer blow to the life Brenda had tried to build on my back. I revealed the forged signatures. I revealed the bribed doctor. I revealed the secret bank accounts. By the time I finished, Brenda was sobbing, not out of remorse, but out of the sheer terror of a predator realizing it had walked into a trap. Her boyfriend had already slipped out the back door, but my security team was waiting for him in the parking lot. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within a week, Brenda was facing criminal charges for elder abuse, fraud, and embezzlement. The judge she had bribed was investigated and disbay read. Her new boyfriend was arrested for financial crimes. The lake house was sold, but not to the developer Brenda had promised it to. It was sold to a conservation trust, as per David's original wishes, a wish Brenda had tried to override. The proceeds went to a charity for veterans, a cause David had loved. As for me, I did not move into a nursing home. I moved into the penthouse suite of the Pendleton Tower in San Francisco. I resumed my position as chairman of the Boa Road. The business world, which had thought Arthur Pendleton was dead or retired, was shocked to see the old lion back in his den. My reputation so read. I was not just the grieving father-in-law anymore. I was the man who had outsmarted a generation of vultures. I was featured in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. People wanted to do business with the Pendleton Trust again, because they knew the man at the helm had eyes that saw everything and a mind that never forgot. I did not seek revenge for revenge's sake. I sought justice. I sought to protect my son's legacy and my own dignity. The young people today think age is a weakness. They think because we walk slower, we see less. They think because we are quiet, we are deaf. But we have lived through storms they cannot imagine. We have built the foundations they stand on. And when they try to kick us aside, they should remember that the roots of an old tree run deeper than they can ever dig. Now, I spend my mornings fishing on my private lake, the same lake where Brenda tried to bury my past. But this time, I am not waiting for a splash. I am enjoying the silence. I am enjoying the peace. I am enjoying the life I rened, the life I protected, and the life I reclaimed. The suitcase is gone, but the truth remains. And the truth, my friends, is the only thing that never sinks. If you have ever been underestimated, if you have ever been pushed aside by those who thought you were weak, if you have ever had to fight for your dignity in a world that wants you to fade away, then you understand. This story is not just about me. It is about every man and woman who has been told they are too old, too slow, or too irrelevant. It is about the fire that still burns beneath the ashes. If this story resonated with you, if you felt that spark of justice, then I ask you to subscribe. Subscribe to hear more stories of resilience, of triumph, and of the quiet strength that never truly fades. Subscribe, and let us remind the world that age is not an ending. It is a beginning. It is a reckoning. It is a legacy. The morning sun cast long, golden shadows across the polished marble floor of my new penthouse office. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the bustling streets of San Francisco. The city was awake, alive with the rhythm of commerce and ambition. But my mind was still anchored to the quiet, misty shores of Lake Tahoe. The confrontation in the study had been necessary, a surgical strike to remove a tumor that had been poisoning my family for years. Yet, as the adrenaline faded, a profound emptiness settled in my chest. Justice had been served, but it had not brought David back. The silence in this expansive, luxurious space was a far cry from the comfortable quiet of my old guest house, where the ghosts of my past still lingered. My intercom buzzed, breaking the silence. It was M.A. Ricus, my chief of security and the man who had been my right hand since the EARLY days of the Pendleton Trust. I told him to come in. He entered with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent decades in intelligence. In his hands, he carried a slim tablet and a leather-bound notebook. He placed them on my desk and gave me a brief nod. He told me that the retrieval team had finished processing the contents of the suitcase, and there was something I needed to see. I sat down in my leather chair, the familiar creak a small comfort, and opened the tablet. What I saw made my blood run cold. Buried beneath the financial records and the burner phone logs was a series of digital photographs. They were not recent. They were taken over the last 2 years, hidden in a private cloud account Brenda had thought was secure. The photos were of me. Me sleeping in my chair. Me walking to the mailbox. Me sitting on the dock, sta ring at the water. They were surveillance photos, taken from a distance, with timestamps and coordinates. But it was the notes attached to each image that turned my stomach. Brenda had been documenting my supposed cognitive decline, building a case for my incompetence long before she had made her move. She had been waiting for the perfect moment, orchestrating a narrative of a senile old man losing his grip on reality. M.A. Ricus stood quietly, giving me space to absorb the information. He told me that the forensic team had also recovered deleted text messages between Brenda and Chad. The messages painted a picture of a cold, calculated conspiracy. They had discussed my daily routines, my medication, my moments of confusion. They had mocked my grief, turned my love for my son into a punchline. One message, dated just a week before the family meeting, read simply, "The old fool is slipping. Push the doctor's appointment. We need the signature by Friday." I closed the tablet and leaned back, my eyes fixed on the city below. The betrayal was not new. I had known Brenda was untrustworthy from the moment she entered David's life. But seeing the meticulous, clinical nature of her deceit was a different kind of pain. It was the pain of realizing that the woman my son had loved had been a stranger all along. She had not just wanted my money. She had wanted to erase me, to dismantle my very identity piece by piece. M.A. Ricus read his throat softly. He told me there was one more thing. He opened the leather notebook and slid it across the desk. It was a handwritten journal, recovered from a hidden compartment in the suitcase. The pages were brittle, the ink faded. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was David's. My breath caught in my throat as I opened to the first page. The date was 6 months before he died. He wrote about his love for Brenda, but also about a growing unease. He wrote about her secretive phone calls, her sudden interest in his finances, the way she would watch him when she thought he wasn't looking. He wrote about his fear that he was being manipulated, but also his fear of confronting her, of shattering the illusion of their perfect marriage. The last entry was dated just 3 days before the accident that took his life. He wrote about a conversation he had with Brenda, where she had asked him, in a tone that was both casual and chilling, about the location of the Pendleton Trust documents. He had deflected her, but the entry ended with a single, ear-breaking line, "I think I'm alright, a ghost." I sat there for a long time, the weight of my son's words pressing down on me. He had known. He had sensed the danger, but he had been trapped by his own decency, by his belief that love could overcome greed. He had died trying to protect me, trying to keep the truth from destroying the family he had built. The guilt was a familiar companion, but now it was sharpened by a new, fierce resolve. Brenda had not just stolen from me. She had stolen David's peace of mind in his final days. She had poisoned his last months with suspicion and fear. I looked up at Americus. My voice was steady, but it carried a weight that had not been there before. I told him to prepare a comprehensive dossier. I wanted every financial transaction, every communication, every lie Brenda had told since the day she met David. I wanted it organized, verified, and ready for legal review. This was no longer just about protecting my assets. This was about honoring my son's memory. It was about ensuring that the truth of his final days was known, that his suspicions were validated, and that the woman who had betrayed him faced the full consequences of her actions. Americus nodded, his expression unreadable. He told me it would be done. As he turned to leave, I stopped him. I asked him about the doctor Brenda had bribed. He told me the man was already under investigation by the medical board, and that his confession had been corroborated by bank records. I nodded, a grim satisfaction settling in my gut. The pieces were falling into place. The web of deceit was unraveling, and I was the one holding the threads. I spent the rest of the afternoon in my office, reviewing the dossier as it came together. Each document, each revelation, was another brick in the foundation of my case. But amidst the cold, hard facts, David's journal remained the most powerful piece of evidence. It was not just a record of Brenda's crimes. It was a testament to my son's character, his intelligence, and his tragic awareness. He had not been a fool. He had been a man caught in a nightmare of his own making, and he had left behind a map to guide me through the darkness. As evening fell, I stood once more by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life. The emptiness in my chest had not disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer just grief. It was purpose. I had spent years playing the part of the helpless old man, allowing Brenda to believe she had won. But she had underestimated the depth of my love for my son, and the strength of the man I had been before I became Arthur Pendleton, the grieving father-in-law. That man was still here. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to return. The game was far from over. Brenda was facing criminal charges, but the true victory would come when the world understood the full extent of her betrayal. When David's name was clear-read, and his memory was restored to its rightful place. I would not rest until that day came. I would not rest until the ghost my son had married was finally, fully, exorcised from his legacy. The suitcase had been retrieved, but the real treasure was the truth it had contained. And I would spend whatever time I had left ensuring that truth was never forgotten. The transition from the quiet solitude of my penthouse to the bustling floor of the Pendleton Tower was a shock to the system, but it was a welcome one. For years, I had allowed my shoulders to slump, my voice to tremble, and my mind to seem foggy. Now, I wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit perfectly over my broad shoulders. My silver hair was neatly combed, and the worn wooden cane had been replaced by a sleek, polished walking stick that I only used when I wanted to emphasize a point. Walking through the glass doors of the executive suite, the air shifted. The murmurs of the administrative staff ceased instantly. Eyes widened, and jaws dropped. The whispers that had circulated for months about the senile old man being routed off to a nursing home were instantly silenced. I was no longer a ghost. I was the chairman, and I had returned to reclaim my throne. My first official act was to call an emergency meeting of the board of directors. These were men and women who had grown comfortable in my absence. They had grown accustomed to taking their orders from Brenda's hand-picked proxies and Chad's slick real estate developers. They had assumed the Pendleton Trust was a sinking ship, ripe for a corporate raid. As I took my seat at the head of the long mahogany table, the silence was deafening. I did not offer pleasantries. I did not ask about their weekends. I simply opened a leather portfolio and slid a stack of documents Tawa RD the center of the table. I informed the BOA RD that as of this morning, all previous financial authorizations made by the interim management team were null and void. I then laid out the forensic audit Americas had proper read, detailing every misappropriated dollar and every fraudulent contract Brenda and Chad had pushed through. The reaction was exactly as I had anticipated. Panic. The vice president, a man named H.A. Risen who had been secretly negotiating to sell off our manufacturing division, turned a pale shade of green. He stammered, trying to explain that the decisions were made in the best interest of the company, that I was too out of touch to understand modern market pressures. I let him dig his own grave. I allowed him to speak, to make excuses, to reveal his own complicity in the scheme. When he finally ran out of breath, I leaned four-way RD, resting my hands on the table. I spoke clear RLY, projecting the authority of a man who had built this empire from the ground up. I told H.A. Risen that his resignation was expected by the end of the day, and that my legal team would be in touch regarding his personal liability for the losses incurred under his watch. He nodded, defeated, and gathered his things. The rest of the BOA RD sat in stunned silence, realizing that the old lion was not only awake but had teeth sharper than they remembered. With the BOA RD secured, my attention turned to the legal proceedings. Brenda was currently sitting in a county holding cell, her designer clothes replaced by a drab orange jumpsuit. Her arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a frantic, desperate clawing for survival. She had hired a high-priced defense attorney, a man who billed by the minute and promised miracles. But miracles are RD to come by when the evidence is as airtight as mine. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning, and I made sure to be there. I wanted her to see me. I wanted her to look into my eyes and realize that the man she had tried to destroy was the very man holding the keys to her cage. The courtroom was packed. News outlets had caught wind of the story, sensing a juicy tale of family betrayal and corporate espionage. Brenda sat at the defense table, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. When she saw me walk in, flanked by Americas and my lead counsel, a flicker of hope crossed her face. She probably thought I was there to offer a deal, to show some grandfatherly mercy. She was wrong. As the proceedings began, my lawyer presented the state's case with surgical precision. We did not just present the financial fraud. We presented the emotional abuse. We presented the surveillance photos. We presented David's journal. When David's handwritten words were read aloud by the prosecutor, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The judge, a stern woman with no patience for theatrics, leaned four-way RD, her expression hardening. Brenda's lawyer tried to object, claiming the journal was irrelevant to the financial charges, but the judge overruled him. She recognized that this was not just a case of theft. It was a case of profound, calculated cruelty. As the prosecutor detailed how Brenda had mocked David's suspicions in her private messages, I watched my daughter-in-law's face crumble. The facade was gone. She was no longer the polished, manipulative socialite. She was just a small, broken woman, drowning in the consequences of her own greed. The climax of the hearing came when I was called to the stand. I walked slowly to the witness box, my cane tapping rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The defense attorney stood up, attempting one last desperate gambit. He asked me if I was confused, if I knew what day it was, if I was taking medication that impaired my judgment. He was trying to paint me as the senile old man Brenda had described. I looked directly at him, my gaze unwavering. I answered every question with CLA righty and precision. I recited dates, financial figures, and legal precedents from memory. I described the exact contents of the suitcase, the timeline of Brenda's thefts, and the emotional toll her actions had taken on my family. Then, I turned my attention to Brenda. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I spoke not to the judge, but to her. I told her that David had loved her, and that he had died believing she loved him back. I told her that her greatest crime was not the theft of my money, but the theft of his peace. I told her that he had known, in his final days, that he had married a ghost, and that her betrayal had haunted his last moments on this earth. The courtroom was utterly silent. Brenda buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. There was no sympathy in the room. Only the heavy, undeniable weight of justice. The judge did not hesitate. She ruled that Brenda would be held without bail, citing the severity of the crimes and the clear danger she posed to the elderly. The charges of elder abuse, fraud, and embezzlement were formally entered, and a trial date was set. As the bailiffs led her away, she turned back to look at me one last time. There was no anger in her eyes anymore. Only a profound, terrifying realization of what she had lost, and what she would never get back. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply nodded, acknowledging the end of a long, painful chapter. Walking out of the courthouse, the flashbulbs of the cameras blinded me for a moment. Reporters shouted questions, asking for a comment, asking how it felt to defeat my own daughter-in-law. I paused, adjusting my coat against the chill of the wind. I looked into the sea of lenses and spoke simply. I told them that this was not a victory. It was a tragedy. I told them that no amount of money or justice could bring back a son who had died in sorrow. But I also told them that the Pendleton Trust would endure, and that my family's legacy would be protected from those who sought to exploit it. I got into the waiting town car, the door closing with a solid, definitive thud, shutting out the noise of the world. I had won the battle, but the war for my peace was just beginning. The town car glided silently through the San Francisco streets, carrying me away from the courthouse and the flashing cameras. Inside the plush leather cabin, the silence was heavy, but for the first time in years, it was a peaceful silence. The legal battle had been won, but the emotional toll of confronting Brenda and exposing her deceit had left a lingering exhaustion in my bones. I leaned my head back against the seat, closing my eyes as the city lights blurred past the tinted windows. Marcus sat quietly in the front passenger seat, giving me the space I needed to process the day's events. He knew that while the gavel had fallen in my favor, the true measure of this victory would not be found in a courtroom. It would be found in the quiet moments of rebuilding what had been broken. When we arrived at the Pendleton Tower, I did not head straight to my penthouse office. Instead, I asked Marcus to take me to the archives on the lower level. This was a restricted array, a climate-controlled vault where the physical history of the Pendleton family was kept. For decades, I had avoided this room. It was a museum of memories I was not ready to face. But today, I needed to anchor myself. I needed to see the tangible proof of the life David and I had built, a life that Brenda had tried so desperately to erase. Marcus unlocked the heavy steel door, and the scent of old paper and polished wood greeted me. I walked slowly down the aisle, my cane tapping softly against the concrete floor. I stopped in front of a glass display case and looked at the photograph inside. It was taken 20 years ago, on the day David graduated from university. He was standing tall, wearing his cap and gown, his arm wrapped proudly around my shoulder. We were both smiling, a genuine, unguerried joy captured in silver halide. I placed my hand against the CL glass, tracing the outline of his face. In that moment, the sting of Brenda's betrayal faded, replaced by the enduring warmth of my son's love. She had taken his final years, but she could never take this. She could never take the decades of laughter, of lessons taught, of a bond that transcended her petty greed. I spent the next few hours in the archives, sorting through old letters, business plans, and family journals. I was not looking for financial documents or legal leverage. I was looking for David. I found a letter he had written to me when he was 22, detailing his hopes for the future and his desire to make me proud. I found a blueprint he had sketched for a new manufacturing plant, a project he had been so passionate about before his life was cut short. Each artifact was a testament to his character, a reminder of the man he was, not the victim Brenda had tried to make him. I realized then that my true legacy was not the billions of dollars in the trust. It was the values David had embodied, and the values I intended to instill in the next generation of Pendleton leaders. By the time I returned to the penthouse, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow across the city. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the transition from day to night. The anger that had fueled me for the past week had finally burned itself out. In its place was a profound sense of clarity. I had spent so much energy fighting Brenda, defending myself against her accusations, and protecting my assets. But I had neglected the most important task of all, healing. I had allowed her toxicity to consume my thoughts, to dictate my actions, and to steal my joy. No more. The next morning, I called a meeting with my executive team, but this time, the agenda was different. We were not discussing lawsuits or hostile takeovers. We were discussing the David Pendleton Foundation. For years, I had kept this foundation dormant, unable to bear the pain of using my son's name. But now, I was ready to bring it to life. I announced that we would be establishing a new initiative, focused on providing legal and financial protection for the elderly, specifically targeting elder abuse and financial exploitation. We would fund RCH, support advocacy groups, and provide pro bono legal services to seniors who had been victimized by those they trusted. The BOA-RD members were initially surprised, but as I outlined the vision, I saw a shift in their expressions. They saw not just a philanthropic endeavor, but a statement of purpose. They saw the chairman of the Pendleton Trust drawing a line in the sand, declaring that the family's wealth would be used to protect the vulnerable, not to enrich the predatory. I appointed a young, passionate attorney named S.A. Ra to head the initiative. She reminded me of David in her idealism and her fierce determination. I knew she would carry the torch with the same integrity my son would have wanted. As the weeks passed, the foundation took shape. I became deeply involved in its daily operations, finding a renewed sense of purpose in helping others. I met with survivors of elder abuse, listening to their stories of betrayal and loss. I saw my own pain reflected in their eyes, but I also saw their resilience. They had been broken, but they had not been destroyed. They had rebuilt their lives, just as I was rebuilding mine. Through this work, I found a community of people who understood the value of dignity, of respect, and of justice. I was no longer just a Ruther Pendleton, the grieving father or the vengeful patria RCH. I was a man on a mission, using his resources to make the world a little less cruel. One evening, as I was leaving the foundation's new office, I received a call from Marcus. He told me that Brenda had accepted a plea deal. She would serve 5 years in a minimum security facility, followed by a decade of supervised release. She would never be allowed to manage finances or work in any position of trust again. The judge had also ordered her to pay full restitution to the trust and to the foundation. It was a harsh sentence, but a fair one. She had been given a chance to confess and accept responsibility, and she had taken it. I hung up the phone and stood in the quiet hallway of the office building. I felt no triumph, no vindication. I felt only a deep, abiding sadness for the waste of a human life. Brenda had had everything she could have ever wanted, a loving husband, a secure home, a place in a powerful family. But her greed had consumed it all, leaving her with nothing but a prison cell and a ruined reputation. She had been a cautionary tale, a reminder of the darkness that can fester in the human heart when it is blinded by entitlement. I walked out into the still evening air, taking a deep breath. The city was alive around me, a symphony of movement and sound. I had fought my battle, and I had won. But more importantly, I had reclaimed my life. I had honored my son's memory, not by dwelling on his tragic end, but by celebrating his beautiful beginning. I had turned my pain into purpose, my grief into action. The suitcase had been tossed into the lake, but from its depths, I had pulled out the truth. And with that truth, I had built a bridge to a better future. I was finally, truly, free. The passing of time is a strange river. For years, I had felt as though I were drowning in it, swept away by the currents of grief and the relentless tide of Brenda's deceit. But now, standing on the balcony of my penthouse, watching the fog roll over the Golden Gate Bridge, I felt like a man who had finally learned to swim. The legal battles were over. The BOA RD was secure. The David Pendleton Foundation was thriving, its mission to protect the elderly gaining national attention. Yet, as the first anniversary of David's death approached, I knew there was one final journey I had to take. It was not a journey of revenge or business, but one of closure. I had to return to Lake Tahoe. I instructed M.A. Ruckus to arrange for the retrieval of the lake house. The property had been in legal limbo, tied up in the messy web of Brenda's estate and the subsequent litigation. Now, with the dust settled, the title was clear. I did not want to sell it to a developer, nor did I want to turn it into a museum. I wanted to reclaim it as a sanctuary. A few days later, I stood once again on the wooden dock where this entire saga had begun. The morning mist was thick, just as it had been on that fateful day, but the air felt different. It was no longer heavy with betrayal. It was crisp, clean, and filled with the promise of a new dawn. I walked through the empty house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The furniture Brenda had brought in had been removed, leaving the space bare and honest. I could almost hear David's laughter bouncing off the walls, feel the warmth of my late wife's presence in the kitchen. This house had been tainted by greed, but its foundation was built on love. I decided then that this would become the headquarters for the Foundation's West Coast operations. It would be a place where seniors could come for counseling, for legal aid, and for community. A place where no one would ever be made to feel invisible or worthless again. As I stood in the center of the living room, looking out at the vast, shimmering expanse of the lake, I felt a profound sense of peace. The ghost of Brenda's malice had been exorcised. The physical reminder of her crime, the spot where the suitcase had broken the surface, was now just a part of the landscape, a silent testament to the fact that truth always rises. I had spent so long looking back analyzing every slight, every lie, every moment of manipulation. But standing here, I realized that my future was no longer defined by my past. I was no longer the victim of a daughter-in-law's greed. I was the architect of a legacy that would outlast us all. The transformation of my public life had been equally remarkable. The business world, which had once written me off as a relic, now looked to the Pendleton Trust as a model of ethical leadership. My return to the helm had sent a shockwave through the industry, proving that experience and integrity were not obsolete virtues. Younger executives, who had been seduced by the promise of quick profits and ruthless tactics, were now seeking mentorship. They wanted to know how I had built an empire that endured, how I had navigated the treacherous waters of corporate politics without losing my soul. I was happy to share my wisdom, to remind them that true success was not measured in quarterly earnings, but in the lives you touched and the values you upheld. One afternoon, I received a visitor at the tower. It was S.A. Ra, the young attorney I had appointed to lead the foundation. She arrived with a stack of reports, her eyes shining with excitement. She told me about a case they had just won, where an elderly couple had been saved from losing their home to a predatory lender. She spoke with such passion, such fierce dedication, that I saw a reflection of David in her. I realized then that my son's legacy was not just in the foundation's name, but in the people it inspired. He had been a good man, and his goodness was living on through the work we were doing. I invited S.A. Ra to sit, and we talked for hours. I told her about David, not just the son I had lost, but the man he had been. I told her about his dreams, his fears, and his unwavering belief in doing what was right. I read with her the lessons I had learned from Brenda's betrayal, the hard-won wisdom that comes from being pushed to the brink. I told her that age is not a weakness, but a repository of strength. That we, the elderly, have weathered storms that the young cannot yet imagine, and that our greatest gift to the world is the perspective that only time can provide. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the city, I walked S.A. Ra to the elevator. I told her that I was proud of her, and of all the young people who were carrying the torch. I told her that the fight for dignity, for justice, for the protection of the vulnerable, was a fight that would never truly end. But as long as there were people like her, like David, like the survivors I had met through the Foundation, I knew that the light would never go out. Returning to my penthouse, I poured a glass of water and stood by the window once more. The city lights twinkled below, a sea of stars in the urban night. I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the anger, the betrayal. It had all been a crucible, a fire that had burned away everything that was false, leaving only what was true. I had been tested, and I had emerged stronger. Not because I had defeated Brenda, but because I had refused to let her defeat define me. I thought about the suitcase, resting now in the evidence locker of the county courthouse. It was just an object, a collection of paper and fabric. But it had been the catalyst for a rebirth. It had forced me to confront the darkness, to face the truth, and to reclaim my power. I had seen my daughter-in-law toss it into the lake, thinking she was burying my past. But she had only succeeded in unearthing my future. As I stood there, a profound sense of gratitude washed over me. I was grateful for David, for the love he had given me and the legacy he had left behind. I was grateful for Marcus, for his unwavering loyalty and friendship. I was grateful for Sarah and the team at the Foundation, for their passion and their hope. And I was even, in a strange way, grateful for Brenda. She had been the storm that had tested my roots, and in doing so, she had proven that those roots ran deep. I took a sip of water, the CL liquid, a soothing balm. The emptiness that had once haunted me was gone, replaced by a fullness of purpose. I was Arthur Pendleton, and I was alive. Not just surviving, but living. Truly, deeply, authentically living. The story of my life was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. And as I looked out at the endless horizon, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them with the strength of my past, the wisdom of my age, and the unshakable belief that the truth, like the sun, always rises.